we've assembled what I think is a fabulous panel this morning to start talking about that, to start opening that up and start engaging with some of these issues so that we might start to see some change in this sector and the valuing of this sector. Our first speaker this morning probably doesn't need much introduction, but I'll give him a short introduction anyway. Fraser Corfield is the Artistic Director and CEO of the Australian Theatre for Young People and has 20 years of experience as the Artistic Director CEO of small to medium arts companies. When I think about people in this sector that are leaders, that are kind of continuously fighting for this sector, Fraser is one that comes to mind. He's always been an enthusiastic engager with us at the University of Sydney, and I rarely suggest an idea to Fraser that he says no to. He's an enthusiastic, curious, and above all, a very talented artist who understands that arts actually live in a culture and live in in kind of imbue that culture with its dynamism. And so ATYP has been a leader in this space for many, many years. So I'd like to throw to Fraser and thank him for not only what he's going to do today, but for all of the work that he's done over a couple of decades now. Thanks, Fraser.
Thanks very much, Michael. That's very generous. Hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I also would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and all our Aboriginal brothers and sisters across the country. So yeah, look, I have to warn you, I get a little self-conscious public speaking anyway, and so talking for this period of time on Zoom is quite a new experience for me. I'm going to see how we go. My 6-year-old son has just managed to delete his entire day's school slides 2 minutes before I had to log on for this, so there's quite a small possibility that the door will open at any moment. And if so, I apologise in advance. So as Michael said, I've been working in the youth art sector for 20 years actually this year. I first went and ran a youth theatre company in South Australia called Riverland Youth Theatre in 2001. But I never had a particular, youth theatre was never my initial passion or drive. I was just interested in theatre and storytelling, and my career started actually, I was very fortunate in my 20s when I was 24 to be resident at a professional theatre company in Brisbane, La Boite, and was there for 4 years as associate director. And I got into youth theatre simply because I wanted to run a company, and the only companies in the country that would give someone at that age, 27 I think I was at the time, an artistic directorship was a youth theatre company. And I just jumped in to get 2 years kind of management experience really, and then I was always going to go back to professional theatre. But I did fall in love with youth theatre from spending time there. And one of the things that kind of fascinated me about youth theatre early on was that there are times that I've been involved in professional productions where it really just felt like a job. You know, you'd be working on a play, but you didn't particularly love the play and you didn't have a particular vision for it. And you didn't feel like it was going to contribute anything, but it was a job, so you took it. But working with young people, I very rarely had that experience, because when you were doing what you were doing well, you always had the feeling that you were creating experiences that would stay with those young people for a lifetime, regardless of what else other things they went on to do. So as it turned out, I stayed in youth arts and have been ever since. And it's been really interesting watching the kind of, interesting is one way of putting it, the changes in arts funding and the way we value arts and the way we look at arts and young people's interaction with professional artists over the last couple of decades. There's been a significant change, and I think we're at a really interesting tipping point at the moment. My hope is that that tipping point will lead to some sort of positivity, but we're certainly getting close to a kind of bottom of the barrel crisis. In 2008, there were 21 federally funded youth theatre companies around the country, bringing professional artists together with young people for experiences. Next year, there will be just 4. in a nation of 47 million children, there are now only 3 federally companies touring professional work for young audiences. We've seen this consistent and slow shrink of our support of youth theatre in Australia. And so one of the things that often when I'm looking at this is going, well, what are the key shifts and what brought them about? And one of them was in 2008, the Australia Council realised that there hadn't been any increase to arts funding for a period of time. And there was starting to become an awareness that that probably wasn't going to happen, that companies that kept seeking more money to respond to growth and innovation and change, there was just no more money available. And so the Australia Council and John Bayliss, who was heading up the theatre board at the time, realised that if they were going to, space was going to be made, then it was going to have to be a circumstance where some companies would have to go in order to create space for other companies to come in, or for some companies to grow. So the initiative in 2008 was called Make It New. And the philosophy, which was implemented in broad consultation with the sector and was warmly embraced by the sector, was that in 2008 a line would be drawn into the sand. Prior to that time, if you received operational funding, then there was a fundamental belief that your organisation deserved to exist, and though that organisation may be better and worse, run for better or worse over a period of time, you should continue to exist, and so they continued to be funded. In 2008, it was a case of saying, all right, some companies are performing well, some companies are not. If you're a company that is not performing well, you should lose your funding so that that money can be repurposed to other organisations to enable growth and development in the sector. It was a really sound philosophy, and by and large, we all embraced it. I think we all embraced it because we all assumed that we would be recognised for the extraordinary work we were doing and we'd be on the positive side of that equation. Of course, it didn't happen, and a number of really important companies were cut. That was the first time that that happened, essentially since the founding of the Australia Council. What has been really interesting to watch since that time is a fundamental then shift in attitude and belief around arts and arts funding. So since then, every time you apply for operational funding from the Australia Council, there is the perception that it does not matter what your organisation has done before. It does not matter how old your organisation is or how established or what kind of legacy it may have created. It is about where you are at that moment that you apply and what your vision is for the coming 4 years. And if that moment and that vision does not appear to measure up to other companies in that round, you will be defunded so the money can be repurposed. Now, what it's meant is that we don't have the same broad sector support that used to exist. And since then, we've seen various elements of the sector suffer, and the sector that has suffered at the coalface of this change is the youth art sector. The other significant shift happened in 2015. So when Make It New hit the wider professional arts, performing arts, there was one program that remained separate to that called the Youth Program Fund, which was specifically for youth theatre companies or youth arts companies, companies that created performance with young people. And there were 12 companies funded through the Youth Program Fund. In 2015, it was determined that that should no longer be the case. Those companies shouldn't be ring-fenced, and they should be in with the others to compete on their own merits as other companies competed. The youth sector at the time was very concerned, and there was a lot of discussion with government about the fact that this would have a negative impact on the youth sector. But it coincided with Brandis's famous cuts to the arts industry. So though there were sort of bigger problems that fell at that time, of course, the things played out as had been raised at the time. So of those, there were 12 companies in the Youth Program Fund and 2 companies funded as key orgs. So there were 14 companies at the time. There are 3 of them currently funded in Australia today. So and one of the things that's really interesting about it, and one of the things I think within this conversation today about how do we value young people? Because of course, whenever we say in Australia, do we value young people? Of course we do. We really care about our kids. We care about their well-being and welfare. But it has been my experience, certainly with an arts funding process, that when a company that focuses on young people is put alongside a company that focuses on adult audiences, over and over, we see the organisation that focus on young people disadvantaged or cut. And we're seeing, and what's interesting is that, you know, within the microcosm of the arts, we often don't talk too much to other sectors, but one of the things that we've been doing in recent years is talking a lot with the education sector and being a little surprised to hear that there is this very similar feeling. And the key element of this, of course, as everyone would be aware of, is this focus on STEM, not STEAM, on science, technology, engineering and maths at the exclusion of the arts. And we're told that we need to prepare our young people for jobs of the future, and that ironically, the arts are increasingly left out of that equation. And one of the things that came up in a conversation I had in a forum actually for Create last year, which I thought was really interesting, that someone pointed out that the things that the arts often prides itself on imagination, on creative problem solving, on out-of-the-box thinking, in actual fact, government and industry tend to identify those qualities as coming from a different sector. They consider it to come from IT, marketing, other creative sectors other than the arts. So the recurring message at the moment seems to be that while the arts are nice for those that can afford them, they're a social luxury, and our society at the moment has bigger problems and we can't afford it. And I guess in a way you could look at that and go, well, that's fair. You know, we're suffering massive social issues at the moment, massive community concerns. Maybe it is a time that we need to put experience of the arts on a back burner in order to address kind of bigger social issues. So then when we look at kind of what are the major social issues facing young people, and one of the things that's always really interesting to look at is the Mission Australia's annual youth survey, which surveys 24 and 26,000 young people aged between 15 and 19 each year. And for the first 14 years, the top 3 personal concerns of young people were pretty consistent. They were coping with stress, they were school or study problems, and body image. As were the top 3 social concerns, which were equity and discrimination, substance abuse, and economic and financial matters. So the first 3 were personal and the second 3 were what's seen as social. In 2016, mental health was listed for the first time as one of the 3 top social concerns by young people. And in 2007, sorry, one of the top 3 personal concerns. And in 2017, it hit the top 3 social concerns. So in 2020, so last year, the 3 things that young people were most concerned about were equity and discrimination, COVID-19, not surprisingly, and mental health. So the recurring mental health budget in the 2021 federal government budget is 2.2 billion. And Scott Morrison's asserted that there'll be 5.7 billion spent on mental health in this financial year. So on the one hand, we're kind of needing to sink a lot of money into mental health, wellbeing, community building. On the other hand, we're recognising that, or there is a perception that we need to pull money from other areas in order to make that happen. And the arts is one of those areas, and particularly youth arts practice, for the tiny amount of money that floats around in it anyway, is one of those areas. One of the things that's really interesting then is that, of course, the 2 things are so connected. And one of the things that fascinates me at the moment is that somehow the arts is not able to make this argument coherently and clearly. But there is this body of work, this body of research now that unequivocally demonstrates that the performing arts actually are a really key component to addressing some of these broader issues, specifically around mental health, body image, stress and anxiety, that are the top 3 personal concerns of young people. we've got a body of research now that shows that young people achieve better test grades, overall scores across all subjects, including mathematics and reading, if they participate in the arts. They're less likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to become involved in volunteer and community services. They feel more connected to their peers and their community. They demonstrate greater resilience in coping with challenges. They've got increased self-worth and self-confidence and sense of well-being, and it strengthens their connections to community, to culture, to peers, and to elders. So these things are absolutely guaranteed now in terms of the amount of kind of research that can unequivocally demonstrate that that's the case. In 2017 ATYP, so this research needs to be updated now because it's a few years old, but we engaged a research company called Pattern Makers to look into whether or not participating in the arts has any impact on young people's mental health and resilience. And if so, is it positive or negative? And is that kind of quantifiable? And so Pattern Makers were able to get in touch with 1,200 current and past participants of ATYP. So they contacted people who'd participated in youth theatre activities over a 20 to 30 year period. So some currently embedded in it and some reflecting on those experiences. So there were a range of different experiences. It wasn't necessarily saying one sort of principle or methodology or one project had these outcomes. It was all these different projects that shared the same common philosophy. And the outcomes were quite astonishing for everyone, actually. So 91% of people said it had a positive impact on their well-being. 89% identified a positive impact on their self-confidence. 85% were more likely to empathise with another person's perspective. 78% identified a positive impact on their self-awareness. 75% felt more connected to other people in their life. There's a range of kind of outcomes. So I guess one of the things that we need to figure out how to do as a sector is to change the conversation around the way arts, participation in the arts, and young people as kind of cultural creators can, that it's actually part of a bigger social issue. It's not a luxury item. And I guess I realise I've used a chunk of my time just to kind of finish up with a project that kind of we did recently which sort of summed that up. We're approached by the Advocate for Children and Young People in New South Wales to do a project that demystifies youth homelessness. Now, usually as the National Youth Theatre, we try and, even though issues are at the heart of every story we tell, we try and stay away from issue-based theatre, because I think one of the deaths to theatre is this idea for kids that every time we take them to the theatre, we have to teach them something. And really, there should be just a joy in the experience of hearing a story and getting involved in characters and being entertained. But so we took this on and we thought, all right, we'll try and build a show that helps explore the range of experiences of homelessness, but does it in a way that doesn't feel like you're participating in some sort of community project. So we went and we took playwright, who you'll hear from in a moment, Lewis Treston, and Lewis ran workshops with young people who've experienced homelessness from Wollongong all the way through to Port Macquarie up the coast. We recorded the voices of the young people that were happy to share their stories and their experiences. And Lewis synthesised them into a series of short stories and scenes that just showed the very different ways homelessness impacts young people. Because with young people, actually only 2% of young people experiencing homelessness sleep rough. It's not the kind of people on the streets idea that we have when we think of homelessness. Young people who are experiencing homelessness experience it in very different ways. They're couch surfing, they're staying with others, they're hopping from place to place. So we put this show on. It was originally done as a season at Riverside Theatre, and the responses from schools and young people was really overwhelming. They really connected with it because they found the stories fascinating, the characters interesting. It spoke to a language, people they understood. And at the same time, everyone that saw that show, you kind of reflected a bit on our society a little differently. And it went so well that it got support for a national tour through Playing Australia. Sadly, on Friday, due to the COVID shutdown, we just had to can that tour. But it came back and it did a season this year before it was to go on tour at Griffin. And we were able to bring in, actually initially, 2 teenage girls from a refuge came to see it. One of them was coming with a group and she brought a friend from the refuge because they thought they'd be interested. The friend didn't want to be there. But when they saw the show, suddenly they saw themselves and their lives reflected on stage. And they saw the experiences that they had, which they thought other people didn't experience. They thought were unique to themselves. And so something of some embarrassment. And so seeing it and having it validated and then having an entire audience of people kind of fascinated and moved and shocked and interested in those stories, the feedback, those 2 then went away and booked 30 other people from their refuge and refuges around to come back and see the show. And one of the things that was so fascinating about that show was the number of people that came up to us afterwards and actually, said, I didn't appreciate that my experience was youth homelessness until I saw this. It sort of spoke to them on that level. It kind of offered a fundamental tool for unpacking a social issue that various organisations have been struggling with previously. So there's enormous potential for what we could achieve in theatre with young people. We just need to figure out how to unlock that conversation and destigmatise the participation in the arts. I think I've gone over time. Sorry, Michael.
No problem. Thanks, Fraser. And I think that's a really effective way to kind of sum up in a few words the history, but also the hope of the sector, where the sector can actually make a really big difference. And I was just reflecting as you were speaking about the research, maybe around 2005, people could have made an argument, well, the research isn't really in about the arts in young people's lives, maybe. But now the research is kind of overwhelming and still we are facing this kind of barrier. So I think I think it's one of those things that we've just got to push back on very forcibly to make sure that the research that has been done is recognised, but also the value of the sector in changing outcomes for young people is recognised, understood, and applied.